Good afternoon. Today we're going to look at our reading for this Sunday from the first epistle of Peter. And actually, we begin looking at 1 Peter this Sunday because we'll hear from this epistle over the next 6 Sundays, the Sundays of Easter. And this is a unique opportunity. It's not often that we get the chance to look at one of the epistles on consecutive weeks, and we will read, for the most part, the entire epistle during the season of Easter. And so we get not only the opportunity to prepare for sermons, but we also have the opportunity to study in its entirety a book of the Bible. Now, 1 Peter is one of what is known as the Catholic epistles. 1st and 2nd Peter, James, Jude, 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John have come to be known as the Catholic epistles because of their worldwide message, their message to all that's applicable to all Christians. That's not referring in any way, shape, or form to the Roman Catholic Church, but rather Catholic here is used in the same terms that we use it in the Nicene Creed, where we talk about one holy Catholic and apostolic church. And the messages of these books can be applicable to us today. And in fact, one of the things I want to talk about today is how there are so many parallels with life in our world as we know it today. When we look at the message that was written to Christians in this first century when the church was just being formed. Now, 1 Peter was written and addressed to all the Christians basically in Asia Minor. All right, and that would be roughly equivalent on your map to modern day Turkey. But specifically look at the inner areas of Asia Minor or modern day Turkey. Not the coastal areas where the big cities were, because those were the hubs of trade and shipping and that, but rather we've moved into the smaller communities, the rural areas of Asia Minor. And that's a unique and important part of the message of 1 Peter, because most of the people who were living in this area were not from there. They were exiles who'd been brought in to the Roman conquerors, taking people, moving them to other places, attempting to force them to adhere to the Roman way of life and the Roman rule of that time, and basically to destroy their own culture, but it rarely worked. Instead, what you ended up with was just groups of people living in the same area, but representing many different cultures, many different languages, many different lands. And that was the case in the groups that the book of 1 Peter was written for. And the other unique thing about this is that Peter is actually talking to a very small group of Christians. Christians in this area were one of the very smallest of minorities among all these different cultures and religious groups. In fact, the Jews and the Christians represented a very small part of the overall population. And the result of that was that they were persecuted. And most of the Jews and the Christians in this area came from what would be the lower economic strata groups. And we believe that many of the Christians in this area were actually slaves. And so they're persecuted based on their economic place in the community, as well as what would be considered by most people to be very foreign religious beliefs, strange religious beliefs, and as well they would be persecuted because they were exiles, they were foreigners. And one of the ways I want to look at that is that what do we see the same kind of thing happening in the United States that we can relate to, because I think there are a lot of parallels here. Now, 1 Peter was in all likelihood at least dictated or transcribed by a disciple of Peter who was taking his words and putting them into a letter that could be read and passed around all the different Christian communities of Asia Minor. There seems to be little doubt that there is a definite influence by the Apostle Peter in this letter. Peter at this time had never actually been to this area that we can tell, that these people had never met Peter, yet he was in Rome and writing to them because they were suffering pretty significant persecutions at this time, and he wanted to give them a letter of hope and encouragement and strength that would bolster them in their Christian faith despite the persecutions and despite the hardness of their life. And I guess if I was going to have to pick out a parallel group within the United States, the first thought that came to my mind were the coal miners of Appalachia, those in eastern Kentucky and West Virginia specifically. And I've traveled in that area, and I've had an opportunity to see that coal mining is a hard way of life. You go down into the mines and you breathe in all the coal dust, and there's a lot of health problems that are associated with that, and you don't make much money. And so all of life is hard, and yet the people of Eastern Kentucky and West Virginia are very religious. There are churches in every community. Most of the time, these are small evangelical denominations. One of my favorite denominations in all of the Christian community are the Two Seed and the Spirit Predestinarian Baptist, and that's a discussion for a whole nother day. But for these people, Christianity presents the hope of the future, of life being better, of life eternal coming with its rewards. And so I think that is so important to put that kind of image in our mind as we look at the book of 1 Peter, because these are people who suffer day in and day out, and it's the hope of the Christian life that becomes for them what they're looking forward to. And we start with the third verse, and what would be basically 7 verses where Peter is saying to the people, you are living in hope now. Hope in Jesus Christ, for we share in his resurrection, and so we have received the promise of eternal life and of eternal life with God. And he begins off by talking about we've received a new birth, that even though we're still living in the old life, we now live in the old poor life of hard work and poverty and struggle. We live in it in a new way. We have a new birth into a living hope, so that even now life is better than it was before, and it will only get better. To borrow a Curcio phrase, the best is yet to come. And all of this is through the resurrection of Christ. And that because Christ was raised from the dead by God, that we have been given an inheritance that's basically eternal. It's imperishable, undefiled, and unfading. And it's kept in heaven, but it's applicable now. And it's protected by God. And it's through our faith that we receive this salvation. And, one of the things you have to do is kind of break this whole section of 1 Peter chapter 1, verses 3 through 9 down into parts. And the reason being is because when it was written in the Greek, it was all one sentence. And what our English teachers used to call a run-on sentence. And so you have to break it down into parts. But I think one of the strongest parts of this, there's definitely a sermon in here, is he says, although you have not seen him, meaning the risen Christ, you love him. And even though you do not see him now, you believe in him and rejoice. And so, there are so many applications for us here today. I think the study of 1 Peter is going to teach us some wonderful things about a book we're probably not very familiar with. Tomorrow we'll look at the Gospel of John for this Sunday. Have a great afternoon.